the city really came together on behalf of the Pacers. The convention center was donated, space was donated there. Arby's donated food. Players came in and manned the telephone lines to take pledges from people. Kids were literally going around their neighborhoods with piggy banks collecting money to bring in for the Pacers. People were invited to come in and entertain. The telethon ran for 16 hours from the evening of July 3rd of 77 till the afternoon of the 4th, about 16 hours. 3 of the 4 local television stations ran at least part of it. You can imagine that, just getting rid of your national programming and televising this local telethon all at the same time. So people had to watch it. And it was just incredible looking back on it. And they got it done. Whatever number of tickets they had to sell, pledges for, or whatever money they had to raise, they got it done and saved the franchise. So something like that had never happened before, and I don't think will ever happen again.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hey, gang, I hope it's warmer where you are than where I am in the wilds of suburban Chicago. Welcome. It's Good Seats Still Available, that curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. My name's Tim Hanlon. I am your humble host, and I appreciate you finding us in podcast land for another exciting journey into what used to be in pro sports. And we are going to go back to our conversation about the Indiana Pacers. Our friend Mark Montieth, the author of Reborn, the Pacers and the Return of Pro Basketball to Indianapolis, was such a hit in our earlier episode in December. Actually, that is episode number 41, if you didn't get a chance to listen to it. We kind of ended at the sort of second year of the Indiana Pacers ABA journey, which dovetails very nicely with Mark's book, Reborn, which literally details those first 2 wild and crazy years, not only of the franchise in Indianapolis, but also the league, the ABA, the American Basketball Association itself. I felt that we need to go back, though, to tell the rest of the ABA and first year of the NBA story of the Pacers. And sure enough, Mark was not only gracious to come back, and we're going to have this conversation in a few seconds, which you'll hear, but he is also contemplating actually more than that, doing indeed the rest of the years as another book. I do highly encourage you, though, to not only listen to that previous episode, but the book, Reborn, the Pacers and the Return of Pro Basketball to Indianapolis, literally is an amazing set of detail and stories, anecdotes, memories, et cetera, of those first 2 years. Mark has done a ton of research and has been around that team, the Pacers, in many of its incarnations for many years, perhaps more so than any other beat reporter and or writer than anybody in Indianapolis history. So we wanted to give sort of fuller fledge to the rest of the ABA/early NBA story of the Pacers. And, it's absolutely a wonderful opportunity to do so, and we took advantage of it. So we're going to do that in just a few minutes with our guest, our return guest, Mark Montieth, in just a couple of seconds. So thank you, and stay tuned for that. A couple of promotional notes to get out of the way as we continue our journey into 2018. Together, we want to thank our friends at Audible, the audiobook service, who continues to delight us with their sponsorship, and we thank them amazingly to do so. And we encourage you, of course, if you have not tried out audiobooks for yourself, there is no easier way to do that than by going to our little website, audibletrial.com/goodseats, to get your free audiobook download and a taste of the service for a month. When you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats to give it a spin for yourself. There are now over 185,000 titles, I'm told. And that number continues to grow by leaps and bounds. You will not be challenged to find something that will be interesting to you to burn one of those titles off for your free trial and your free 1-month subscription to the Audible service. That's audibletrial.com/goodseats. You can cancel at any time, And audiobooks are amazing and fun and great way to pass the time, along with podcasts such as this one. So give it a try. We appreciate you doing so. audibletrial.com/goodseats. Try it now. Free 1-month subscription, if you will, to the Audible service, as well as a free audiobook download to enjoy. Also, we are brought to you by the good graces of our friend Dean Mitchell and his site, sportshistorycollectibles.com. Sportshistorycollectibles.com, that is the place for amazing memorabilia, whether that be media guides or programs or schedules or buttons or pennants, you name it. Sportshistorycollectibles.com has it, from teams and leagues that still exist today, and many, many more that, for whatever reason, as we love here on this show, do not exist today. Use the promo code GOODSEATS for a 15% discount on all your purchases at sportshistorycollectibles.com. And again, our thanks to Dean Mitchell, the proprietor of said site, and some amazing stuff, new stuff every week that goes up there. And the imagery alone is well worth the checking out. But of course, you should indeed take a look at making a purchase of such as well. I guarantee you will find something that will be interesting to you and will not gnaw at you to make that purchase. Again, sportshistorycollectibles.com. It's a fun site. And again, if you find something that's of interest to you that you'd like to have, make sure you use the promo code GOODSEATS at checkout for 15% off. Okay, let's segue nice and smoothly into our second and very detailed and interesting conversation with our friend Mark Montieth. He, the author of Reborn, the Pacers, and the Return of Pro Basketball to Indianapolis. And we get into more NBA, actually the first year of the NBA, but prior, the amazing years of the ABA version of the Pacers in our conversation. Coming right up. So when we last left off, we were kind of at the tail end of the second season, which is where your book sort of trails off and kind of sets the scene sort of for what is to come later. I thought it was also interesting, too, because the end of that season, this is the 1968-69 season, the Pacers made it all the way to the championship series against the completely resurgent Oakland Oaks. And I'm not sure you got a chance to listen to our episode over the holidays, but we had the pleasure of being able to talk with Oakland Oaks owner Pat Boone and his reminiscences of his 2-year adventure, shall we say. But clearly, here's a team in the Pacers that is absolutely on the ascendance, and it seems to me that the third season of their existence, the 69-70 season, was ostensibly their greatest season, certainly up to that point, and perhaps even in the ABA recollection of their years, perhaps their best overall.
Yeah, I think that was the year they were the most dominant in the league. They had their championship nucleus, and while their later championship teams, when they added George McGinnis, were probably better teams, I think the Pacers were farther ahead of the league in the 69-70 season. They really dominated. The ABA was still fledgling, and there were some pretty bad teams in the league, and the Pacers really dominated. So they didn't have too much trouble, really, in 69-70. As you look back on it, they really should have won the championship that year. Bill Sharman was a great coach, and he had the L.A. Stars playing as well as they could play, but the Pacers just had far more talent than L.A. did that year.
Well, aside from the nucleus of the team returning in Messrs. Brown and Lewis and Daniels, and obviously Neto was back, you had an NBA veteran who had kind of crossed the lines, and a guy named John Barnhill, and frankly also a well-known rookie in the person of Billy Keller, who I guess was pretty well known for free throw and his prowess behind the 3-point line. It seems to me that those were kind of like two of the sort of spark plugs or missing ingredients, I guess, of an already strong nucleus of a team.
Yeah. The Pacers were good about adding some NBA veterans in those days. You mentioned John Barnhill. They also had added Tom Thacker the year before. Thacker was on the 69-70 team as well. Later years, they added Gus Johnson for their 72-73 championship team. So they made some pretty smart pickups to bring in experienced players to play off the bench in those years. And Billy Keller was a really important guy, really one of the more underrated Pacers, I would say. He is one of four players who were on all three championship teams, 70, 72, and 73. Keller was a rookie on the 69-70 team. He was a seventh-round draft pick, both ABA and NBA. He was well known in Indiana because he was on the Purdue team that reached the championship game at the NCAA tournament in 1969, losing to UCLA. But Rick Mount was the All-American on that team, the guy who averaged more than 30 points a game. Keller was a point guard who sacrificed a lot of scoring to set up Mount and Herm Gilliam, who was on that team and had a 12-year NBA career. So Keller, went underappreciated, below the radar kind of player, even though he was the Naismith Award winner. He was the first winner of the Naismith Award, which goes to the best player in the country under 6 foot tall. So Keller was Indiana's Mr. Basketball in 65. He out of high school, his team won a state championship. He was well known, but still was not given a great opportunity to even make the team. Obviously, the Pacers didn't think so. They would have drafted him higher if they thought he could. So he wound up, not being absolutely crucial to that team, but he was really important to that team and even more so to the later championship teams.
Now, we talked in our previous episode when the sort of second season of the team was around. That's when Slick Leonard sort of, I guess, around the beginning of that season, kind of came in. But this season, 69-70, was really his first sort of start to finish imprint, I guess, on the team. And I'm just curious as to how much he was able to more flex his muscles, either in terms of the personnel that was coming in and or staying, as well as his impact on his desire for tempo of the game and under completely his own control.
Yeah, he did take more control, no question. One thing he had said at the end of that 68-69 season, when they reached the ABA finals, he kind of left it open. Well, I'm not sure if I'm coming back or not. He had just signed a contract for that year, taking over 9 games into the season. And he said, one thing I know for sure, though, if I'm coming back, I'm going to have more control over personnel matters. And apparently got that. Mike Storn was the general manager, and Storn did a good job. But he was good, I think, about giving the coach a lot of freedom and putting together the roster he wanted to coach. So the Pacers made, a lot of moves that year. Slick was he had to be controlled. In fact, he liked to make moves on the spur of the moment, or he'd get mad and want to trade somebody, whatever. Storn had to talk him off some ledges, let's talk about it in the morning, that kind of thing. But Slick, without question, had more control over the roster, and having a training camp with these guys, he was able to, like you say, have an imprint from the very beginning, and they reflected that. They won 59 games that year, 59-25 in an 84-game season. And, they got off to a great start, and they rolled all the way through the season.
Well, it's interesting to take a quick pause on Slick for a second. I mean, Slick Leonard, I without saying it in so many words, I get the sense he's sort of maybe a controlled hothead, so to speak, right? And there's a famous incident in 72, I think it was, 72 or 73, certainly that season, and there's some famous pictures of it too, where he apparently kicks the ball into the stands against what then became a pretty heated rivalry with the Utah Stars when they got realigned in an early season game. I guess he got a couple of technicals and he got fined, and it almost became kind of symbolic, I guess, of his fiery nature, at least on the court, genuine or not as it might have been overall.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. He had incidents that if they happened today would get him suspended for a long time. It's amazing, really, kind of what he got away with back then. He did kick a ball into the stands in Utah. There was a game, the home game, where he took the ball rack and just shoved it out on the floor, and the balls are bouncing every which way. He would occasionally put his hands on a referee. He would say things in the newspaper that, you would really get in trouble for today. Like in 75, they're playing San Antonio in a playoff series. And he said something along the lines of, hey, if Bob Bass walks across that midcourt line, I'm going to deck him. This kind of thing. In my book, there's a quote from the second year where he says, hey, if they want to fight, we'll fight, this type of thing. So he was very temperamental. Some of it was for show, I think, and he's known as a really good guy. And as soon as the game was over, everything was forgotten. He and his wife, Nancy, used to have parties at their house, and they would invite the referees and the members of the opposing team and this kind of thing. So it was just kind of all within the confines of the game, but that certainly set the tone for his players, and they followed suit, to have this fighting spirit. But Slick got away with things back then that are just totally unheard of today. And while he did take some fines, no question about it, there would be far more severe penalties today for some of the things he got away with.
A couple of interesting things in that 69-70 season, one of which was, I think, the still a standing record. Well, obviously, the ABA didn't exist past 76, but a record for points in one game against the Pittsburgh Pipers, 177 to 135. I just can't imagine that today. Just up and down, clearly a non-defensive game, but it almost sounds like some of the old classic NBA All-Star games in terms of no defense, but it was. I was
at that game.
Okay, and so at what point did you know you were on to something that was notable in history?
Oh man, like you said, obviously no defense, and then you got guys, hitting 3-pointers that have no business even taking 3-pointers. Pittsburgh was not very good, and the Pacers, mucked it up by just giving up layups so they could get the ball back, that type of thing. And that's another thing that they would be highly criticized for today if they dared do that, just doing whatever they could to get more points. But people just didn't take it as seriously back then. They had scored, the previous year had scored 172 points in a game. So that wasn't the first time they got over 170. So it's just amazing to think about that today, that could happen. But it did, it did. And I don't remember a lot of details. I just remember, guys like Nedelicki out there shooting 3-pointers, and the game was kind of a joke, but it was entertaining. People got into that kind of thing, and the ABA was such a wild and free league that people kind of got excited about stuff like that. People didn't really criticize it. People just thought it was entertaining.
Well, and certainly by comparison to the NBA, which is a bit more staid and a little bit slow and a little more plodding, I guess, and obviously had all sort of that heritage of sort of the game sort of being a true cager kind of thing. I mean, do you think defenses, in general in the ABA kind of got short shrift, not only on the court, but maybe in the annals of history? Or do you just think it was just the up-tempo sort of nature and an adjustment, frankly, versus the quality of defensive play?
Yeah, defense wasn't then what it is now. Some people want you to believe that NBA teams don't play defense now. Of course they do. Teams would get 200 points today if people didn't defend. The game, contrary to what those players might want to say, wasn't as physical then. You could get to the basket, not get knocked down as often. Certainly it was physical, and they had rugged players and that type of thing. But really there's more flow to the game, and fans probably would have appreciated that more, than what you see today with so many fouls and everything. But, defense was not what it is today, because forget about these 177-point games. There were a lot of 130, 140-point games back then, and the 3-point shooting was not better than it is today. You just look at the percentages. Nobody was shooting 40% from the 3-point line back then like players do today. Even a guy like Rick Mount, one of the great shooters of all time, was a 31% 3-point shooter as a Pacer. And Roger Brown, was a low 30s percentage 3-point shooter. So it's not that they shot better. It's just that the defense wasn't as strong, and the game was a little more up tempo, and it was run and gun. It was a playground game back then, and people enjoyed that.
Also interesting that year was that the All-Star game came to Indianapolis. Was that a signal that the league found Indiana to be a model franchise, or at least one where they were worthy of hosting the game? Obviously, there must have been some love by the owners to have the third season's All-Star game in Indianapolis.
Yeah, well, the first season's All-Star game was here, 67-68, and the franchise had done a great job putting that on. They lost money on it. The Pacers lost like $30,000 on the All-Star game the first year, but they got it televised to many major markets in the country, and it looked good on TV, even though the attendance wasn't nearly what they claimed it was, particularly the paid attendance. But it still televised well, and it was a really good moment for the league to get the product exposed around the country. And the second one was in Louisville. And so they brought it back to Indianapolis for the third one, and they did have a national telecast for that one. I also attended that All-Star game as a fan, and it was a big deal. You know, any ABA game that was on national TV seemed like a really big deal back then, and the league needed the exposure so badly. I believe that was a year there was a boycott that nearly caused the cancellation or postponement. The players were starting to organize and wanted some kind of union representation. And there was a meeting and so forth, and they didn't take the court for warm-ups, you know, until late. But still, the game went on, and it was a good show, and it all worked out. But it was kind of a near miss there. I mean, it would have been obviously devastating if something like that happened. And the players knew it. I don't think they were going to boycott the game, but they were just trying to get a voice, get some representation, and, you know, establish some kind of power within the league, because the league was becoming established, and the players, you know, wanted to participate in the development or the improvement of the ABA.
Do you happen to remember who might have been broadcasting that game that season?
Well, my guess would be Don Criqui. He did a lot of the ABA games. He did the playoff games, I know. So that's my best guess, because I know he did, like when the Pacers played the LA Stars in 1970 in the finals, Don Criqui was doing games. And that's where I would guess first. I'm pretty sure it was him.
Yeah, and the broadcaster, I doubt it was NBC though, right? I'm wondering if, I know HBO broadcast a bunch of games in a couple of years afterwards. I know like the famous dunk competition, I know, was an HBO presentation, a fledgling HBO back then. I guess we'll put it to our audience as to maybe where that video can be found, because it would obviously be really cool to sort of see some of that stuff in action. And I know some of the ABA enthusiasts out there discover some of these tapes on a regular basis and post them on YouTube.
Yeah, they're out there. In fact, I know somebody here in town who's got one of the Pacer playoff games from, I think it's the 73 season, has the game in its entirety with commercials and everything that he's invited me to watch with him. So things do surface now and then. And, you know, it's, and I don't know about 1970 though. I don't know if there's an entire game or not, because that's, you know, when Roger Brown had the peak moments of his career, and I know people like to see that stuff, but they were televised. I mean, you know, I remember staying up late for the games in LA to watch them. They were televised, and again, it was a huge deal for the ABA and for the fans to have those games exposed like that. But a lot of it's gone. You know, as you know, people just didn't keep the tapes of that. You know, the film was expensive then. It wasn't videotape. It was stuff on film, and it got reused or thrown away, and a lot of history got lost.
Well, the end of that season, I mean, the Pacers obviously winning the championship in 69-70. They not only did they win the championship, but it appears to me that they literally blitzed through the playoffs. I mean, they seem to be quite dominant, and almost to the point of it being almost a fait accompli, especially after that first series sweep of Carolina, and then a 4-1 series dismissing, if you will, of Kentucky.
Yeah, they did, and that shows how dominant they were. Yeah, they swept Carolina the first round. They lost game 1 to Kentucky at home in overtime, then won the next 4 games without a whole. Well, you know, they were reasonably close, but then they beat LA 4-2 for the championship. They should have won it in 5 games. There's kind of a famous story from that. You know, the Pacers were up 3-1. They're coming home with a chance to win the ABA championship on national television. I think it was CBS that was doing the games. And the cameras are set up in the locker room, champagne's on ice in the locker room. They're going to have this huge celebration, winning their first ABA title. And lo and behold, Bob Nettlich goes water skiing the day before the game. This game was played on a Saturday, I'm pretty sure. And Netto, on a Friday, it's warm, it's late in the year, and he goes water skiing with some friends. So he shows up for the game with sore shoulders, sunburned, and he's shooting air balls out there because he's tight. And I think he went 7-22 from the field, something like that. And the Pacers lost. They lost this home game. It was a classic case of assuming too much, of thinking you've got it made, and, some pressure on yourself. So they had to go back to L.A. to win the series. And it was, all three of the Pacer titles were won on the road, and this was one they should have won at home. But they just, between Neto going water skiing and the players just not responding to the moment the best way, they had to go back to L.A. and win it.
Was Neto disciplined in any way, or was it just sort of an assumption about his unique style and approach, shall we say, to playing the game of basketball?
No, I don't think he was disciplined. I don't think that it was known, for a while that he had gone water skiing. He was sunburned, but, as far as anyone knew, he had just spent time outdoors. And I don't think it was really known the reason why he played poorly. He did have a lot of rebounds that game, but his shooting was so bad. But I'm sure he wasn't the only one who didn't play up to par. I don't think some other guys did as well. They just didn't handle the moment, really. But it's one of those things that had it come out then, there would have been a lot of criticism for. But since they won the title and it comes out in later years, people just think it's funny.
Yeah, let alone the insurance risk, right, which is obviously a modern day thing. Can you imagine?
Yeah. I don't think you'd have – just imagine today if a player the day before a title-clinching game in the NBA Finals were to go out and go water skiing. Can you imagine the blowback on something like that? I mean, again, that's the ABA for you. That was just a different time.
How did the city of Indianapolis respond to the championship, right? This is a league that's been only around for 3 years, right? And we talked earlier in our episode 41, sort of in the nascence of the team, the nascency of the team, the growing love affair and the, I guess, putting on the map of Indianapolis as a major city with a professional franchise in the ABA. What was the reaction? Was it a true outpouring of emotion, or was it muted? What was the sort of response from the fans of Indianapolis to this championship in 70?
Oh, people were excited. Yeah, no question. They treated it as if they'd won an NBA championship. As far as people here were concerned, ABA was every bit as big a deal as the NBA, and this was our deal. And people, really got excited about it. People met the team at the airport when they flew back the next day. Of course, they're not flying charter then, so they stay overnight in L.A. and come back the next day, and people greet them out there. There was a parade that I believe went from the team headquarters on 38th Street downtown to the Circle, so 38 blocks. And they used to have these ham and bean dinners at the fairgrounds to celebrate these championships like that. We're open to the public, maybe $5 a person, that kind of thing, and it'd be televised. So the city got really excited. Again, Indianapolis was wanting to get on the map, wanting to be a major league city. And this was something that everybody took a lot of pride in. It was treated like a huge deal. And, I think as far as anybody here was concerned, it was every bit as big a deal as a Super Bowl or an NBA championship or World Series championship.
Yeah, but with a bit of homespun quality and goodness and genuineness, right? Ham and beans. Can you imagine that in the city of New York?
I know. Oh, I know. And that's something. I think they had sponsorship. And I remember watching it on television. It was they televised the thing. It's a shame there's no tape of that. I think it would be hilarious to see today. The only thing I remember from their post-season banquet, Mel Daniels and Nettlich used to kind of go as a tag team. This is kind of yin and yang, two guys who were opposites who became good friends, and they would, the players would all get up and take their turn at the microphone, and they'd go up together and kind of just do almost a comedy routine, Mel would say, "You go ahead, Neto," and Neto would say, "Oh, that's awfully white of you, Mel," that kind of thing, and joking around. And, so it was something that was good for the city. I think it just made the city feel good, about being a championship city.
Well, they were certainly drawing very well as well. They were clearly stable, and it's by comparison to some of the other hijinks around the league, probably a good thing for everyone involved, not only in Indianapolis but also in the league itself, to have a real example of stability and success, and portending well, hopefully, for the future. But it's interesting in the off season, though. Arguably one of the architects of that success, the general manager, Mike Storen, resigns to go to Kentucky. Why would you leave a situation like that to go to another franchise, given all that success?
He got an offer he couldn't refuse, basically. He got a piece of ownership by the Colonels. Storen had been in many ways the architect of the Pacers championship team in 70. And, he was an ambitious guy. And Colonels called with just an offer he could not refuse. One of the funny stories related to that is that when he went in to clean out his desk in Indianapolis, I guess before he had officially signed his contract with the Colonels, he wrote a letter addressed to the general manager of the Kentucky Colonels, proposing that the Pacers and Colonels play like an 8-game exhibition series the following season, just to save money, to play a bunch of exhibition games against one another. Then when he got down to Kentucky and signed his contract and assumed that role, he responded to that letter and accepted the offer. And what do you know? The two teams played like an 8-game exhibition series the next fall. So he played it from both ends. But
were they natural rivals, the Colonels and the Pacers? I mean, certainly regionally on the map, it looks like they could have been.
Yeah, no question. 2 hours apart. Called the I-65 series. Interstate 65 separates Indianapolis and Louisville about a 2-hour drive. And for that reason, we're absolutely natural rivals. And a lot of Pacer fans would go down, particularly those in southern Indiana, would go down to Louisville for games. The Pacers would often organize bus trips for $10, whatever. You get a ticket to the game and a box of lunch, that kind of thing. And so it was a great rivalry, yeah.
Well, it's interesting, too, because as that season came about, 70-71, there was realignment. And in Indianapolis, or the Indiana Pacers actually went to the Western Division and almost immediately were met by what became, oddly, not geographically certainly, a new rival pretty quickly in the Utah Stars. Do you think the realignment had any positive or negative effects either for the Pacers or that rivalry with the Colonels or the league, or was it just simply dealing with the realities of a certain amount of teams and having to just place them in an even way across the country?
No, that was another thing that was manipulated. When Storen got down there, he and the Pacer leadership, probably Dick Tinkham, the team's legal counsel, they were good friends. They had been in the military together, Marines. They got together and arranged this so that the Colonels and Pacers would meet in the finals. They were considered, if not the two strongest franchises, two of them. And so they kind of manipulated it on their own so that the Pacers and Colonels would not have to meet before the finals. And that was another thing Storen arranged to do. I mean, the ABA, you could do that kind of thing then. There was really, I guess you'd say, a lack of leadership at the top. And a couple guys could get together, and I'm sure they had to convince, other owners or whatever, but they kind of manipulated that whole thing to get the Pacers out west. It didn't really make sense geographically, but they just wanted to separate the Pacers and Colonels so that they wouldn't bump heads in the early rounds of the playoffs.
Oh,
and
that's very
I don't know if it were. What's that?
I said that's very interesting. I mean, the fact that they would go to that, to kind of break up what I would imagine would be a great rivalry if they would meet on a regular basis, right, to intensify it, but apparently not.
Yeah, well, they met a lot during the regular season, and so the rivalry was strong, and they did wind up, of course, meeting for the championship in 1973 and again in 1975, but, that was the whole plan, and again, Storen's very upfront about that today, let's spread this out, so that the Pacers and Colonels won't have to meet too early, that we both have a good chance to get to the finals.
So going into that season, which obviously was not as successful as the season prior, and we sort of hinted at this in our previous episode, that'd be episode number 41 for those who have not listened to our first interview with Mark, please, by all means, pause this one and go back to that episode, or as soon as this one is done, go right back and download and listen to it. But I do want to touch on it again because more evidence of it comes about, not only in this season, but in a few more seasons. Is their use of the draft and/or to be able to bring in rookies from local schools, right? In this case, this year, as we mentioned earlier, the draft pick being Rick Mount from Purdue. Not only talking about Mount and his sort of contribution, I guess, this season and a few seasons thereafter, but maybe you can kind of remind our listeners as to sort of the rationale about sticking to having a fair amount of local rookie and or collegiate product in the Pacers organization. And was that indicative, by the way, of just the Pacers' unique ability to kind of find and stoke interest on the local level, or was that something that other ABA teams were also doing too, that sort of geographical kind of tie-in with new and rookie talent?
Yeah, I think other ABA teams did it. The ABA was so focused on mere survival that there were basically no rules. We've talked about, splitting the Pacers and Colonels east and west and things like that. The Pacers won the championship in 1970 and were still able to sign Rick Mount, not because they had a draft pick, for when Rick Mount was available. Obviously, as a first-team All-American, he would have gone very, very high. If you had the ability to sign a player, you just did it. The other teams in the league didn't care. It was whatever great college player you could bring into the league, bring him in by all means. Don't worry about the draft. The ABA had a draft, but it was almost a joke because the Pacers obviously would not have been able to draft Rick Mount, who was a two-time first-team All-American, if you had a normal draft like you have today, where you go in inverse order of your regular season record. So the Pacers added Rick Mount, and people need to understand, while not a big name today to younger fans, in Indiana in 1970, he was the biggest name. He had been Mr. Basketball in 1966. He was on the cover of Sports Illustrated, the first team sport high school athlete to be on the cover of Sports Illustrated. I think there had been some Olympic swimmers or so forth who had been. But Rick Mount, a story by Frank DeFord, was the cover boy in 1966, and that was as big a thing that could possibly happen to an athlete in 1966, being on the cover of SI. And so he has this great career at Purdue, and it seemed perfect for the Pacers because they had four set positions. You had a point guard in Freddie Lewis, you had a small forward in Roger Brown, a power forward in Bob Nedelicki, and a center in Mel Daniels. They just needed a shooting guard to go with them, and preferably a three-point shooter to add to that mix. And Mount seemed perfect because he was the best shooter in the country. And so they added him, and there was huge excitement about that. He actually signed his contract on a live television broadcast here in Indianapolis. That's how big a deal it was. They televised it. And the bad news about that, the thing that people didn't pick up at the time, is that Slick Leonard didn't attend. He didn't go. He did not want Mount to be signed. He was against it because he didn't think Rick fit in to his style of coaching. I don't think he just didn't like Mount as a personality and didn't think he was needed. But this is a case where Storn overruled him and said, look, we need this guy to sell tickets. He's going to sell tickets like crazy. So they signed him, and Mount wound up playing 2 seasons for the Pacers, but it turned out to be an unhappy experience for all concerned.
That's very interesting. Right. So 2 quick questions on that. And again, more projecting sort of generally. So what I think I hear you saying is there wasn't any sort of ironclad or written, shall we call it, territorial strategy by the ABA or its teams. It was more of a, heck, you're closer to those regional situations. And if you can get those players, especially given, obviously a competition for talent coming out of college with the NBA, go get them, right?
Yeah. Like, Kentucky signed Dan Issel, for example. The Colonels added Dan Issel. and you could go around different parts of the league. But basically, the ABA just wanted every great college player it could get its hands on, and whatever team had the means of signing that player, it went out and did it. And the Colonels later signed Artis Gilmore, and Mike Storns kind of told me the story behind that. But that wasn't regional, but they had the means of doing it. The ownership had the money to do it. So by all means, please go do it. It was all about survival for the ABA.
Well, okay, and am I projecting here that that possibly there were some, shall we say, clandestine efforts to ensure some of those signings? Because I think as you hinted before, an ABA draft, arguably perhaps even after or before, or even against the NBA, it feels to me that as a fledgling, only 3+ year old league, shall we say, other means might have to be explored in order to secure some of this talent versus sort of the more traditional ways of getting that talent.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Yeah, no question.
Any stories that you remember perhaps of maybe things or untoward or curious as to how people might have been discovered or found or onboarded before more traditional methods of drafting and or signing?
Well, I think with the regarding the Pacers, I don't think that for example, the Pacers signed Rick Mount in 70 and George McGinnis in 71, and I don't think they were slipping money to them or anything like that. But I think those players knew, during their final college season, that the Pacers wanted them, and that they had that opportunity. I think in the case of the Colonels and Artis Gilmore, there had been conversations throughout his last season down in Jacksonville. And, Mike Storns told me the story. There's an all-night negotiation with Gilmore, like before Christmas, when they agreed to a contract, so there were things like that going on throughout the league, and probably, for all we know, in the NBA as well. It was just a much less defined time. So, shall we say, I don't know what the rules were, but, certainly there was a lot going on behind the scenes in those days to get players lined up.
Well, Mel Daniels had a superstar season, right? He was the MVP of the league, and Larry Brown clearly continuing his dominance that he exhibited in the playoff series before by being a first-team All-Star. But, of course, they did not replicate the success that they had the year before and lost to the eventual champions, their newfound rivals in the Utah Stars, who they apparently just beat out in the new alignment during the regular season to kind of win their division or the playoff position in that. So not necessarily a bad season by comparison, but clearly not the heights of the year before. But as we segue, you mentioned yet another local product in George McGinnis, right, who comes in that next season, a pretty large contract. And he, of course, was transformative and arguably, I guess he's a Naismith Hall of Famer as well. Perhaps a few notes on George McGinnis and his impact. He of Indiana coming into the team.
Yes, George, was just an incredibly dominant high school player. He was Indiana's Mr. Basketball in '69. We've talked about, you can see the nucleus the Pacers are building. They have Billy Keller, who was Mr. Basketball in '65, Rick Mount from '66. Now George McGinnis, who is Mr. Basketball in '69, joins the team. And he had gone to Indiana. He was just an incredibly dominant high school player, led his team to an undefeated season and state championship. Indiana has an annual high school all-star series with Kentucky, play 2 games every June. And McGinnis, in the second game of that series in '69, had scored something like 53 points and grabbed 30 rebounds. That tells you how dominant he was. And he went to IU. Freshmen were not eligible for varsity competition at that time. As a sophomore at IU, averaged 30 points and 15 rebounds a game, and was like a third-team All-American, something like that, first-team All-Big Ten. And he needs to get to the pros because his father had been killed in a construction accident. His summer after his high school year after his senior year in high school, had been killed in a construction accident. He fell off a scaffolding downtown. And so George's mother now has to support George and his sister. She's taking in ironing and things like that. They didn't get much of an insurance settlement out of it. So George wants to earn money as quickly as he can. And after his sophomore year at IU, signs with the Pacers. And he was ready. He was so physically advanced that he was ready for the pros even at that age. So, he's joining a team that really was already the best in the league. Even though the Pacers didn't win the title in 71, they had the best record in the regular season and really kind of blew it. In fact, if to backtrack a little bit, Slick Leonard kind of messed around with the starting lineup in that series with Utah in 1971 and probably cost the Pacers a championship in that regard. At least some of the players feel that way. But anyway, you're adding George McGinnis to a team that's already probably the most talented in the league. And it was almost too good to be true for the Indiana fans. You got Billy Keller, Rick Mount, and George McGinnis, and Mel Daniels, and Roger Brown, and Freddie Lewis, and Bob Netolicky. I mean, it truly was that first year too much talent for one roster to contain. They developed some issues as the year went on with, trying to keep everybody happy with playing time. But George McGinnis was just think of Karl Malone or LeBron James. He was along those lines. He was obviously younger and less disciplined, but still that kind of physical freak of nature who could dominate a game all by himself. And he joins this team that already is superior. And it didn't take him too long before we started dominating in the ABA as well.
Okay, friends, sorry for the interruption. Just wanted to quickly remind you that today's episode of Good Seats Still Available is brought to you by our friends at Audible, the premier provider of digital audiobooks with over 180,000 titles to choose from in just about every genre you could think of. Audible titles play on iPhone, Kindle, Android, and more than 500 devices and MP3 players for listening anytime, anywhere. And for a limited time, my audience can listen to a free download of any book that they choose, as well as get a 30-day free trial when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. That's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And you can choose from over 180,000 titles, as we said, including one that I'm listening to right now. It's called The 10-Gallon War by John Eisenberg. That's the story of the NFL's Cowboys, the AFL's Texans, and the feud for Dallas's pro football future. Another one on my list, which I have yet to download, but is on my queue, that could be interesting to our audience here, is called The National Forgotten League by Dan Daly, entertaining stories and observations from pro football's first 50 years. Those are just two of the many thousands of titles to choose from, and not just in sports history, but you name the genre that you might want to listen to, and Audible's got it. By the way, two guests perhaps that we'll have on the show, hopefully sometime soon. But again, go to audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free 30-day trial, as well as your free audiobook download to try it out for yourself. Again, that's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And now, back to our conversation. All right, besides McGinnis, who obviously went on to a gigantic career in the ABA, in the NBA, obviously a Hall of Famer, and we'll get to a few more of his exploits in a couple of seconds. I do want to take a great note for a player that I came to love when he went on to the New Jersey NBA Nets. When I was growing up as a kid at the old Rutgers Athletic Center, for people who remember those days before the then Brendan Byrne / Meadowlands Arena, Darnell Hillman. And not only for his play, known as, I guess his nickname was Dr. Dunk, right? So I think in many respects, at least this is my personal belief, you're the pro, and we're there for some of this stuff. I would argue that Darnell Hillman, arguably maybe one of the most underappreciated or underrated players, especially when it comes to the idea of dunking, which I think Dr. J really kind of inherited with that 76 All-Star Game performance. But before Dr. J was kind of doing his thing, I think it was really Darnell Hillman with he of the flowing fro. His hair was obviously well known around the league too. I would argue that he was kind of perhaps more the pioneer in the sort of era of the dunk, shall we say?
Yeah, I agree. You're talking about a 6'9" guy who was a 7-foot high jumper. Most guys that tall, don't have great vertical jumps, but Darnell did. He was on the track team at San Jose State with John Carlos, for example, of Olympic fame. And he even tells the story how on his first day as a freshman in college, he's over there. He had gone 6'6" in high school, and he's over there practicing high jump bit, working on his form, looking pretty, clearing the bar at 6'6". And Carlos ran over and grabbed him by a shirt and threatened him, saying, "God dang, you put that bar at 7 feet and start knocking it off. Set your goals higher. Don't be showing everybody what you can do. You got to try harder. You set that bar at 7 feet." And Darnell did. And lo and behold, in his first meet as a freshman, cleared 7 feet. And kind of taught him a lesson right there about goal setting and all kinds of things. And so you're talking about a guy who's already tall, who is a great jumper, a trained jumper, not just a guy with natural hops. He's trained his body to be a jumper. He had been in the Army for a couple of years. He got drafted into the Army. In fact, he tells the story. He's on a bus in the Army when somebody on the bus says, he's looking at the newspaper, says, "Darnell, you just got drafted." He says, "What are you talking about? I'm already in the Army." And it turned out the Pacers had drafted him. There was something in the newspaper about that. He didn't even know, anything about the Pacers or whatever. So he joins the team the same year as George McGinnis, and they are great friends to this day. You're talking about, two pretty colorful guys, two great additions, two great personalities to the team. George, as great as he was a humble guy who respected the older players and respected authority. And he had a strong father. And so he's a great addition. And Darnell, same thing. Darnell's a great personality. Darnell was great in that he didn't mind being kind of a supplemental guy. He didn't see himself as a star. He had the discipline of being in the Army. To this day, Darnell Hillman works for the Pacers in their front office and community relations. And he's, just another guy with a cubicle doing his job, does a great job day to day. Great meeting the public, great getting out of the community, doing different events. And Darnell was a perfect addition for that team that already had all these star players. But the fans loved him because, again, his jumping ability. He was a great dunker. And beyond that, he had the afro. He had the best afro in the league, and he took great care of it. He combed it out every day. It was neatly attended to. He tells the story that, Slick ordered him to get it cut, and he got a little bit trimmed off, and he kind of tried to smash it down, a little bit, and Slick, got on him again about getting it cut. He said, "Slick, come on now. I take good care of this afro. It's not sloppy or anything, and you don't tell the white guys to cut their hair, so there's nothing wrong with this," and Slick let it go. So he, was just a real colorful personality and a really nice guy that people could sense when they watched him play. And again, fun to watch just because of his dunking ability. And if he stole the ball and had a breakaway, everybody got excited because they knew what was coming.
Now, maybe at some point we'll try to get Darnell on this little podcast as well. But maybe you can
probably a good idea. Yeah, he'd do it.
Yeah. Before we get off of him for a second, there are rumors that he, not only his jumping ability was tremendous, but he was able to, according to legend, jump high enough to grab quarters off the top of backboards. Any recollection of that, or is that urban legend?
That's urban legend. I don't think anybody's ever done that. You always hear that story about he could grab something off the top of the backboard. I've never seen it done. I've asked Darnell that question, and he plays coy, says it could have been true. It might have been true. But he couldn't do that. For one thing, to actually do that, you've got to take a running start and get right next to the backboard without running into it, that type of thing. And, I've never talked to anybody who said they saw Darnell do it, but that kind of thing always becomes legend. You hear about certain guys maybe in Rucker Park or, from the playgrounds in New York being able to do it, but I just don't think it's ever been done. But what Darnell could do was run to the basket and kick the rim. He could put his foot on the rim. Now think about that. That goes back to his high jumping days. And he would do that at clinics, like, Billy Keller or somebody would have a summer camp, and Darnell would go out there and kick the rim. And that, to me, is just about as impressive as being able to grab something off the top of the backboard.
Well, amongst all that, a second straight championship. Did the city regale similarly, and was the talk of dynasty on people's lips at that point?
Yeah, people, definitely were still excited about it. No question. They beat the Nets in 1972. And, Rick Barry, of course, is a member of that Nets team. And by the end of the year, George McGinnis is starting. He'd taken over the starting spot from Bob Nedelicki. And so you got this rookie. And Roger Brown is still playing at a high level. This is actually Roger Brown's last year as a full-time starter for the Pacers in 72. His body is already kind of betraying him, partly because of age and partly because he didn't take care of it. And, Mel Daniels was a great player. Freddie Lewis was the MVP of that series. And Freddie Lewis, in my mind, is the most underrated Pacer and the guy who should have a number retired at the Fieldhouse today. He was the one who led that championship in 72. But it was a great series, beating New York. Rick Barry obviously had been the big name in the ABA from the very beginning. So I know the fans got really excited about beating Rick Barry's team. And it was another big deal, no question about it.
Yeah, and we talked about the importance of Rick Barry in our previous episode with Pat Boone, which we encourage our listeners to go seek out because arguably that's episode 42. Obviously, Rick Barry was a big deal, and in many respects, that was the anticipated future and value of that franchise. Which didn't happen in the Oaks' first season, but certainly did in the second season, and then obviously once he was moved with the team and all that. But obviously, Rick Barry, a quintessential all-star in many respects, and to be able to defeat a team in the Nets with a superstar such as Rick Barry. Pretty darn good thing. And look, this is the second championship in 3 seasons. And going into the 72-73 season, it seems like all the pieces were in place to, frankly, continue unimpeded in the years to come. And clearly that next year was adventurous, but also yet another championship. However, without Bob Nedelicki, right? So he was sold to Dallas. Rick Mount, after 2 seasons, was sold to Kentucky for some bucks and a little bit of change. You had Donnie Freeman come in, an all-star himself, with the Chaparrals. But it's clear that McGinnis clearly stepped up and became not only the force of the team, but a true force, if not the force, in the league this season.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about that 72 title is that there were some things going on beneath the surface that a lot of people around here weren't aware of. You had 2 players, Nedelicki and Rick Mount, both say publicly they wanted out during the finals. In the case of Rick Mount, he talked to a New York reporter when the Pacers were in New York to play the Nets, saying he was, I should never have come here in the first place. Spick and I don't get along. And I want out, and that got out in the New York papers. And once it did, it was repeated in the Indianapolis papers. And Nedelicki made his trade demand through the newspaper in Des Moines, Iowa, where he had gone to college. He went to Drake. So that didn't get repeated locally. And in fact, I didn't even know it until I was researching my book that he had done that. And I was looking through the newspapers of Des Moines, and he said, I'm hoping to play for the Colonels next year. And I'm told now that Nedelicki and Mount, they lost starting spots. They'd be sitting on the bench over there next to one another, grumbling about their playing time or, pointing out, oh, that teammate, he's not playing well. We ought to be in there instead of him, that kind of thing. So you had all that going on beneath the surface, and yet they still won the championship. So obviously, the other players were able to ignore that, but kind of an interesting thing about that 72 title. So they did, Slick, I think, gladly got rid of Nedelicki and Rick Mount in that off season. And it was
Did you ever talk to Slick about that and sort of those days where, that was happening? Because it seems like that required some deft management, I guess, on his part, given their run in the playoffs.
Yeah, I haven't really. I mean, I haven't talked to him a lot in the last, 6 months or so. I mean, I talked to him at games and so forth, and I haven't brought that up specifically, but he has told me that, he they got rid of Nedelicki, and then Nedelicki was later begging him to come back. Bring me back, Slick. Bring me back, please. And he kind of soft sells the problems with Rick Mount. We might, to backtrack a bit, Rick Mount, is, again, wildly popular, is not playing as much as he wants with the Pacers. Slick's trying to manipulate it and start him, but not play him that many minutes. And there was a headline in the Indianapolis Star during that 71-72 season. Imagine this, the Sunday morning paper, the banner headline in the sports section of the Indianapolis Star reads, "Mount fed up with Leonard's excuses." And again, the guy who wrote the story quotes an anonymous teammate, who, by the way, was Mel Daniels, saying, "I don't know what's going on. Rick really didn't get a fair chance," that kind of thing. And so that exploded. And so everyone knew there was trouble with Mount, and they just kind of carried on and got through the season. And I think everybody knew that there was going to be a change that summer. And Slick just didn't want Rick there in the first place, didn't care for us. Rick's a pretty withdrawn, introverted guy, didn't mix with the teammates, not a physical type of player, not a defender, strictly a shooter, and just wasn't Slick's kind of player. And again, I think Slick resented having Mount forced on him. So even though Mount had some big games for the Pacers, it was kind of destined for failure. And I think everybody was relieved when Mount was sent off to the Colonels. And again, Mike Storn down in Kentucky, he wanted Mount, and he was glad to take him.
Well, going into that next season, it looks like the major addition was Donnie Freeman from Dallas. Seems like there's some real drama there, right? We talked about Slick kicking the ball at the Utah Stars game, and there's some great classic photos of that. And I guess even the Stars commemorated that little event in the next game by giving Slick either a plaque or some kind of ball or some kind of recognition for his outburst in the game. So there's some friendly rivalry with the Stars, but perhaps maybe you can kind of talk about maybe what's probably the most seminal moment of the 72-73 season, which was the finals against Kentucky. This you mentioned it before, the I-65 series, literally culminating in the finals. And what a finals series it was, right? 7 games and a lot of drama and fireworks that eventually led to the third championship for the Pacers. But any vivid memories of that sort of classic series in the finals that year?
Yeah, the weird thing about that series was that the visiting team won. The visiting team won game 1. The visiting team won game 3. The visiting team won game 5. The visiting team won game 6 and 7. So home court advantage meant nothing in that series whatsoever. And it was a classic. By this time, the Colonels have Artis Gilmore and Dan Issel, 2 Hall of Famers. The Pacers have their collection of Hall of Famers, future Hall of Famers. Louis Dampier also on that Colonels team. So great talent in a great series. It came down to game 7 in Louisville. It's an afternoon game. And the Pacers, that was George McGinnis' series, really. I think Freddie Lewis was actually kind of positioned to win the MVP of that series as well, but he got hurt. And then game 7 down there, Freddie was injured, Mel Daniels was in foul trouble, and McGinnis just took over and scored 27, 28 points in that game. He wound up getting MVP for that series. And this was George McGinnis really at his best. Not he wasn't the best player he was ever going to be, but he was certainly the best player of that series, and the Colonels had no answer for him. And again, the Pacers win a championship on the road. They could have done it the previous game up in Indianapolis and didn't get it done. So that's why today, when I hear people talk about, home court advantage is so important for the playoffs, I think really, certainly wasn't ever for the Pacers. But obviously it means something. But for a variety of reasons, the Pacers won all their championships on the road, or clinched all their championships on the road. So, the whole motto that year was 3-73, third championship in the 73 season, and they got it done. And at the very end of that game, somebody unfurled the banner down there, 4-74. They were already looking ahead to 74, but certainly that wound up being kind of the last run for that championship team, the core of that team that won 3 ABA championships.
Yeah, it also though seems to be I don't want to call the zenith of the franchise, but is clearly in the year or two that follows a couple of other substantial changes, right? I mean, clearly the team humming on many strong cylinders. I mean, bringing Len Elmore, for example, in the next season, and reacquiring Neto and McGinnis, just pounding it out with just huge points and rebounds performances in games and whatnot, and playoff. They never not made the playoffs, right? So clearly, as a product, obviously very strong. But the idea of moving, right? We talked about this in the earlier episode, right? The facility that they were playing in at the fairgrounds, right? Not necessarily befitting, I guess, an increasingly popular and major franchise in a league that would not go away. And maybe you can kind of give some hints as to some of the broader implications by this new arena that was planned and constructed, I guess, largely because of the Pacers' success in a Market Square arena in downtown Indianapolis, a home of their own.
Yeah.
Right?
Right. The success of the Pacers, made it clear that people thought, okay, they're here to stay. And the Coliseum just really wasn't adequate. The Coliseum was built in 1938, 39. It was kind of a Depression era WPA project. Nice facility, still is used today for hockey and for college basketball. Been remodeled, of course, but it's a cool building, but just not really adequate. The capacity was about 9,100. The locker rooms were inadequate. The sight lines weren't that good, that type of thing. Just not a good modern day facility. So there was talk of building a new place beginning in the early 70s. And there was talk about building something out in the suburbs, out in farmland on the northwest side of Indianapolis. But then Mayor Lugar, Richard Lugar, who went on to become, a longtime senator, a very good one, in fact, was the mayor and a young progressive guy. And he stepped in and said, no, we're going to do this downtown. And he got it done. And they built the arena downtown. And downtown was dying, really, at that point. The shopping had moved out to suburbs. Again, the Coliseum is on 38th Street, so 38 blocks north of downtown is where the Pacers were playing, and there just wasn't much going on downtown at all in the early 70s. So Mayor Lugar saw this as a way to revitalize downtown, and they got Market Square built, and kind of a public type of project, and it worked out great. It opened in the 74-75 season, but it obviously had been in the works long before that. And the Pacers were the main reason for that. And that's why you can argue the Pacers' role in Indianapolis being what it is today. I mean, their success got Market Square built. Market Square kind of kicked off downtown revitalization that continues to this day. Some people would argue the Colts wouldn't be in Indianapolis if not for the success of the ABA Pacers, because you can connect those dots. So that was crucial. Not only crucial for the Pacer franchise, but for the entire city of Indianapolis.
But am I correct in noting that the team also had some financial troubles? It seems that some of the ownership shifted a bit or significantly when they became involved with another fledgling league, which maybe didn't have as much, impact in the city as much as the Pacers did with the WHA, the Racers, the Indianapolis Racers. Any sort of understanding of sort of that situation? Because it seems like that relationship with the Racers kind of got the team, perhaps, if not generally off target in terms of finances, even more so because of that relationship.
Yeah, I know the ownership changed. I mean, the original ownership group, even when the Pacers are winning titles, are not making money. And I think these guys were ready to move on and not be bothered by it. I've been told by one of the original owners that he probably lost between $20,000 and $30,000 personally of his money, and a new group takes over. And yeah, they do have the hockey franchise, and I can't tell you a lot about that. I mean, the best memory of the hockey franchise is that Wayne Gretzky played for the Indianapolis Racers back then as a teenager, but that's kind of what they're known for today. You know, they had a decent following, but certainly the ownership group was really stretched thin. It's not until the Simon Spy, the team in '83, that the Pacers have adequate ownership. So they're still a long way off from that in, the early '70s.
Well, it didn't seem to affect the team in terms of its playoff ability. I mean, clearly not nearly near the success at their height in years earlier, right? McGinnis still making it happen. As a matter of fact, he was the co-MVP of the league with a fledgling Julius Erving in the 74-75 season. But, and even in the playoffs in 75-76, terrifically keeping that streak alive, but with a losing record, right? So it's clear that now, I guess maybe it's really important to maybe put all this in context, right? So as the Pacers sort of continue to hold more of their own despite sort of the ownership challenges, they've got a huge shot in the arm from not only the city and the region, but with a new facility. It's clear that the finances are wobbly, but maybe you could juxtapose that with where the league itself was at in 74-75, as it inevitably looked towards some kind of relationship or merger or something with the NBA. Because clearly this wasn't something that just popped up in 76 when it was finally achieved. Maybe you have a bit of for our audience, a bit of a sort of a background of how the ABA was sort of faring and where it wanted to go in the lead up to 76. Yeah,
there had been efforts for a merger going back to the very early 70s. And in fact, it almost happened, I think, in around 1970-71, and did not. And the ABA was kind of dying a slow death. I mean, the Pacers were a strong franchise. Kentucky was, Utah was, Denver was okay. San Antonio got things going well, but there just wasn't enough depth to the league. The ownership wasn't stable in all areas, and there wasn't really enough talent to fill both leagues adequately. So there was growing pressure for that. But the ABA, the NBA obviously had the upper hand. The ABA was the one that was dying. The NBA was okay, and they were able to kind of ride it out and force the ABA teams into a desperate deal. As you know, only 4 ABA teams joined the NBA. It's not, I guess you call it a merger, but only 4 teams survived, and team franchises were folding. Players were being dispersed. The Baltimore Claws, folded, and their players were dispersed around the league, and it just wasn't working. It was no longer working. You didn't have enough good franchises. So it was unfortunate, but it was kind of inevitable as well.
How do you think the Pacers made their case to be one of those 4, right? That's obviously the team that you knew the most and the best versus the others that maybe didn't make it. How and why do you think the Pacers and arguably with some shaky finances behind them, how did they make their case and to be one of those 4 chosen in your mind?
Well, they were the best attended franchise. They drew the best. They had the best fan following. Kentucky wasn't far behind. Other teams did okay, but they had that. And then, frankly, it came down to being able to come up with the money. There could have been other ABA teams that joined, but there was a $3.2 million entry fee. And somebody had to come up with that. And in the case of the Pacers, it was a man named William Easton, Eason, who wasn't really a sports-minded guy, a real smart guy who had a company here. And he's the one who wrote the check. And he went to the meeting in New York, and he got it done. And that's what got him in. It wasn't a matter of being approved. It was a matter of having the money to do it. And so you had, Denver and New York and San Antonio doing the same thing, but it really came down with being able to come up with the entry fee. John Y. Brown of the Colonels took kind of a buyout from the rest of the ABA. And as people know, the Spirit of St. Louis owners got the best deal of all time by agreeing not to be part of the merger. They took a deal where they got 1/7 of the television revenue of the 4 ABA teams that did go in, which they still get paid on today. So it really was, basically a matter of coming up with the cash and getting in there.
Yeah, that's something we discussed with the producer of the ESPN 30 for 30 episode devoted to the spirits of St. Louis with our friend Dan Forer. And we're actively trying to get Dan Silna to kind of regale us with sort of that story behind all of that in the sort of deal of the century, deal of the millennium, I think, for sure. But yeah, I mean, you look at Kentucky as a successful franchise, right? And I think there are still a lot of people in Louisville who argue that could have been Louisville's shot at being sort of big league for a long period of time too, had that buyout not occurred. But it's other people's money, right? And you don't know if it's not your money. You don't necessarily have the right to sort of, project. But I think a lot of people in Louisville, having lived there for a period of time myself, would sort of argue that that could have been a seminal moment in the city's professional ambitions itself. So I guess maybe one of the best sort of ways to kind of conclude our little journey here in the Pacers' early history, and that being the ABA, was sort of their segue into the NBA, right? Maybe you can kind of give a little bit of a understanding about how that first season, bumpy as it might have been, for the four franchises of the ABA, including the Pacers, sort of went. There is also another, as we've hinted at before, another ESPN documentary, this being of a shorter variety, ESPN short, about a particular event. I think it was that first NBA season, again, indicative of, some of the financial hardships of the team as it segued into the NBA, a telethon of all things, to, raise not only awareness, but season ticket money, et cetera. Again, I'm projecting here, but what was that sort of transition like, going from, arguably one of the most stable, and it's a relative statement, franchises of the ABA into this big uncharted territory of the much bigger and more professional legacy of the NBA in that 1976-77 season?
Yeah, it was a combination of entering a new league, a stronger league, stronger competition, and being a franchise that happened to be in a downward cycle. The Pacers won their last title in 73. The following year, they came back with that same team again and wound up losing a 7-game series to Utah in the second round of the playoffs. And by this time, Roger Brown's really declining physically, and Mel Daniels isn't quite what he used to be. And that team got spoiled by success. They had all this, all 3 championships, and they're getting pretty high and mighty, that kind of thing. So they kind of have their last run in 73, 74. The Pacers trade off everybody but McGinnis for that 74, 75 season. They have like a Cinderella run to the finals where they lose to Kentucky in 75. And this was George McGinnis at his peak. As you mentioned, he was co-MVP with Julius Erving. And then McGinnis goes to Philadelphia in the NBA strictly because he could double or triple his salary at that time. And there were no hard feelings from the Pacers, really. They couldn't match the money he was going to get in Philadelphia. Everybody kind of tipped their cap and wished him well. So the Pacers come back in the final ABA season, 75-76, with a much weaker roster. Some decent young talent, Billy Knight, Lynn Elmore, Billy Keller is still a Pacer. Darnell Hillman is still here. But they have a losing record, 39-45, still make the playoffs in the dying ABA and lose in the first round. And then join the NBA, which is a huge relief to everybody here to be part of the NBA finally and to have new life. But again, they don't have a really strong roster, and they had to give up their first round draft pick to get into the NBA. I mean, the NBA kind of stripped all these 4 ABA teams down to the nubs, to let them into the league. So the Pacers have a losing record. They're reasonably competitive, but they have a losing record, and they get through that first NBA season and they're in trouble financially. They, even though they had sold more tickets in that first NBA season than they did in the last ABA season, the expenses are greater. They're in Market Square Arena now. Everything costs more, and they're losing money. And it turns out they're told, again, Bob Leonard is the GM. His wife, Nancy, runs the front office as the assistant GM. And they're told that, look, we got to raise X amount of money. We got to sell X number of tickets by this date or we're done. The owners are pulling up shop and we're out of here. And Nancy Leonard and this is the documentary you're talking about, the 30 for 30 short, organizes a telethon in about a 10-day period, 10 days, 2 weeks tops, which is pretty remarkable when you think about it. When she began calling around about, hey, how do we do this telethon? She called a guy here locally who who participated in that Jerry Lewis telethon, kind of the local branch of that, and muscular dystrophy. And, I think I have that right. He said, you can't do it. It takes a year to do a telethon, to organize one. Well, she did it 10 days, 2 weeks. And the city really came together on behalf of the Pacers. The convention center was donated. Space was donated there. Arby's donated food. Players came in and manned the telephone lines to take pledges from people. Kids were literally going around their neighborhoods with piggy banks collecting money to bring in for the Pacers. People were invited to come in and entertain. The telethon ran for 16 hours from the evening of July 3rd of 77 till the afternoon of the 4th, about 16 hours. 3 of the 4 local television stations ran at least part of it. You can imagine that, just getting rid of your national programming and televising this local telethon all at the same time. So people had to watch it. And it was just incredible looking back on it. And they got it done. Whatever number of tickets they had to sell, pledges for, or whatever money they had to raise, they got it done and saved the franchise. So something like that had never happened before, and I don't think will ever happen again.
Well, it defies logic, right? I mean, here's a professional team with arguably unmatched success in the ABA, right? Where, literally looking to the public in a very public way to raise money to stay in town. So it's hard to believe, and that's why that documentary short is well worth watching. Yeah, because
a professional franchise basically standing on the street corner with its hand out. Hey, brother, can you lend me a dime? It is amazing.
This was also the time where the telethon, right, obviously pioneered by Jerry Lewis and the MDA, but was a very strong mechanism by which to raise funds. I mean, if I remember correctly, the Democratic National Party. One year even had a telethon on television to raise funds. If you can sort of believe.
Yeah, a different time. People responded to that kind of thing back then. Yeah.
But I guess my question really is, where did Bill Eason go or come from? Right. In that, he's the one who put up the bond, if you will, or the money for getting into the NBA. Did he not have the funds to kind of operate the team as well? Where did he get the $3.2 million to get that? Did he borrow that? Was that part of the problem? Any general understanding as to sort of how they got into that financial position so quickly, especially after having convinced the powers that be that they were one of the 4 franchises that should have been taken by the NBA? You'd think they'd be right?
Yeah. He just kind of faded. His name was really rarely mentioned, and at the time it was all behind the scenes. He was like an engineer type of guy. I think his company was Roach Diagnostics. He invented diagnostic equipment, that type of thing. And so he had a whole lot of money, but he just kind of did this as a favor to the city and didn't have interest in being an NBA owner, probably didn't have the money to operate a team, day to day. I have never talked with him. He's long gone. I have talked to his wife, and, she talked about how he was at this meeting in New York and wound up having to stay longer than he anticipated and only had one shirt, this kind of thing. And, but he got it done and then faded back into the woodwork. And the new ownership group just didn't have the money, just to operate it the way it needed to be operated. And there were players were being sold off strictly for cash, that kind of thing. Again, they had lost George McGinnis, and there were others they were losing because they simply couldn't afford to match salaries. So, yeah, it was just a weird thing again where Eason did his little favor and disappeared again, and was really not heard from again as far as the Pacers go.
Where do you remember where the team was rumored to be possibly going and or purchased by, or is that not really sort of known?
Yeah, in '77 there weren't any rumors of where they would go. It was just like, we're going to fold. We're out of business if we can't get this amount of money. Later in '83, they were going to go to Sacramento when the Simons bought him and saved him in '83. And I've talked to the guy who was behind that effort, and he says, I might have kept him in Indianapolis for a while to see how it went, but this guy wound up buying the Kansas City Kings and moved him to Sacramento. So 77, there were no rumors of where they might go, and it all came up very suddenly. They finished the season. The Leonards were in Hawaii scouting a all-star game of some kind, and that's where they got the call, like, hey, owner says we got to raise X amount of money by this particular date or whatever, or we're done. So they came back and went to work.
Well, if there are any patron saints of the Indiana Pacers franchise, it's obviously Bobby Slick Leonard and his wife Nancy. And, I guess we'll maybe sort of end our journey together, Mark, with this question is, you've covered the team and you've been a fan of the team from its earliest days. The trajectory of the team now, right? Obviously, some amazing years in the '90s with Reggie Miller, obviously, and then some of those legendary battles with teams in the playoffs like the Knicks and Patrick Ewing, et cetera. The team obviously has never gotten to that sort of championship mount again, but clearly emblematic of a city that still continues to support very strongly and arguably has a lot of identity attached to this team. How do you feel the Pacers are set for the years ahead in an NBA, which is obviously much, much different than it was back in the day? How do you feel about the team now and going forward and its role in the NBA firmament?
Well, as you and I are speaking today, I feel good about it. We know how quickly things can change, but they, at this moment, have a good young nucleus. The fans here like this team. They enjoy watching them play. It's a young team that should get better. You have, Victor Oladipo, who played college basketball at IU. You have Miles Turner, who's 21 years old. Sabonis is a young player. You've got a core that looks like it can get better going forward. And the franchise is also positioned to have money to spend in the off season and have a means of improving the roster. So you have that, and you have Herb Simon, still alive, and still active as an owner, has pledged that this team is staying here, and he's going to pass it on to his son, Steve Simon, who is a good guy. So the city, I think, feels secure that the Pacers are going to be here. Even if there are some down years, this ownership group isn't looking to sell out. It's connected to the city in a lot of different ways. I mean, to the power structure, they've taken favors from the city for improving Bankers Life Fieldhouse, that kind of thing. So there's a strong relationship, and the team will be here. And at this moment, it looks like they have a positive future. Now, again, things do change quickly in the NBA. If we had been talking in 2014, I would have thought, yeah, that team can be a contending team for a few more years. That team had reached the conference finals for the second year in a row and had years still ahead of it, but a variety of things happened, and that team wound up being broken up. So you never know. But right now, today, things look really good for the Pacers. And the most important thing of all, I think, is that they're going to be here. The people don't have to sweat out the future of the Pacers in Indianapolis like they did at times in the past years. The team will be here. It's just a matter of how good they can make the team.
Well, Mark, this has been a great journey, and I think it's also one that's going to continue, because it's my understanding that Bob Nedelicki, Dick Tinkham, and Robin Miller, local journalist as well, have a book coming out shortly called "We Changed the Game," which I believe is going to be focused on not only sort of ABA stuff, but obviously Pacers-related stuff too. So I can't imagine that looking back into the history of how this team got started in its early years and its fundamental tie to the region and the city of Indianapolis specifically, can't help but burnish the legacy of this team and how important it is, and its success going forward. Because obviously, without these struggles and these interesting times, and it's a franchise that certainly has defied logic on a number of different levels over the years. I think that's kind of important stuff when you look at the future as well. And to deny the past, right, is, as we know, can always be a challenge when people look forward and ignore what might have been built on their backs in the past. So I want to thank you tremendously. Now is your golden opportunity for promotional goodness. We obviously promote the book both before and after our little interviews and stuff, and have before. But give our audience a bit of a sense of not only your book about the first 2 years, but also other things that you're currently involved with and where people can find out more information.
Oh, thank you. Well, Tim, I've enjoyed the conversations. And my book is called Reborn, the Pacers and the Return of Pro Basketball to Indianapolis. And it covers the formation of the franchise in 1967, the events that led up to that, and how the franchise got off the ground. Those first 2 seasons were absolutely crucial to just survival and kind of set the table for the championships that followed. My original intent was to do something on all the ABA seasons, but I've got 400 pages on the formation of the franchise in the first 2 seasons alone. A lot of biographical information, info in there as well on some of the characters of those first 2 teams. So it's been well received. I've been very gratified by the response I'm getting to it. It's available on Amazon.com, on BarnesandNoble.com. It is available at bookstores throughout the state of Indiana, whether that's a Barnes & Noble or one of the others. So it's not difficult to find. And I think anybody who's a fan of not just the Pacers, but the ABA would enjoy it. And even beyond that, I think it's just kind of it's a human story of people coming together to make something happen. The heartbreak and joy that goes into being a professional athlete, and all the crazy things that can happen. And so hopefully it would be an enjoyable read for anybody who's a basketball fan.
And broadly, your website and other things that you have done and are doing as well.
Oh yeah, markmontieth.com. I have information about the book there. I have the entirety of another book I wrote called Passion Play. It was a book that came out in 1988 that was an inside look at Purdue's basketball season. I was given total access to that program, going to coaches' meetings, sitting on the bench during games, being in the locker room. That book is in expanded form on my website. A lot of the articles I've written on former Pacers and other people over the years. I also had a radio program for 6 years called One-on-One, in which I interviewed for an hour, kind of like what you're doing now, aired on the radio, different sports personalities, including many ABA people, many former Pacers. So that's all on there on my website, markmontieth.com. And I do want to do a couple more books. I want to do something on the championship years of the Pacers, the years we've talked about. Also on the teams that preceded the Pacers. You know, the pro basketball story in Indianapolis really goes back to the early 30s. And I'd like to do something on those because back in the day, I talked to the guys who played on those teams in the 30s and 40s. A lot of crazy stories from those years, as you can imagine. So I do want to do a book on that as well. So I plan to keep busy for quite a while.
All right, you Pacers fans, you can't say that we haven't given you enough love on this here show. Mark Montieth, we thank you tremendously. Mark's book, again, is called Reborn, The Pacers and the Return of Pro Basketball to Indianapolis. It is the first 2 years, really, of the ABA version of the Pacers when they first started with that fledgling league. And as you heard from Mark, there are more books in him to come. And in particular, much of what we talked about today, the years after those first 2 years, as well as its entree, the Pacers, into the NBA in 1976, 1977. So we look forward to seeing that book from Mark in the months to come, and we'll absolutely have Mark back to promote that if and when it is ready to do so. We also want to remind you that Mark's overall website, where not only you can purchase the book, although you can find the link for that, of course, on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search for episode number 45, or frankly, also don't forget to go to episode 41, which was our first interview with Mark. But Mark does other things in life too, including beat reporting for the Pacers today. He's got other books out there, as he's mentioned, one called Passion Play, season with the Purdue Boilermakers back when they were coached by legendary coach Gene Cady. Mark's got a whole bunch of other stuff. He's got a very touching story about his battle and survival with cancer. His website is Mark Montieth. That's Montieth, markmontieth.com. That's where you can find out more about all that Mark does and is continuing to do, and keep in touch with him directly if you'd like. And perhaps if you got some stuff, some stories, some input about the later years of the ABA version of the Pacers, he may just indeed appreciate that as he puts his work together for that hopefully upcoming next book. For us, we want to thank, of course, our friends at Audible, audibletrial.com/goodseats. Don't forget to get your free 1-month version of the service and a free audiobook download. sportshistorycollectibles.com. Don't forget to use your promo code GOODSEATS for your 15% discount there. We want to thank our friends Podfly Productions, in particular Jerry Payne and the boys and girls at podfly.net. And again, if you want some help in getting going with your own podcasting stuff, including production, etc., or you just don't know where to start, podfly.net. Tell them that Tim Hanlon and or Good Seats Still Available sent you, and I'm sure they will be more than happy to guide you in the right direction as they have me over the last year or so. And for us, if you want to follow us, please do. We love your tweets and your comments and all that kind of stuff. Make sure wherever you listen to us that you rate and review generously, especially if it's positive. We always appreciate that. That helps our algorithms, whether that be on iTunes or Google Play or all the other various places that we're available, wherever you pod, as we say. And on social media, let us know where you are and if you're enjoying the show. On Twitter, we're at Good Seats Still. On Instagram, you'll find us at Good Seats Still Available. And in Facebook land, you will find us a page devoted to us as well about the show. Just find us when you search Good Seats Still Available there, too. Okay, I'm done. Thank you so very much. I appreciate your listening. More good stuff next week. Take care, and we'll talk to you then.